It's Wednesday, and I'm glad that you've joined us for our brief Bible study period here. We've been looking at the portraits of Jesus as we see them portrayed by, first of all, the gospel writers. Then in the book of Acts, the preaching of these early preachers, Peter and James and John and others, Stephen. And then we looked at the picture of Jesus presented by Paul in his various writings. Now we want to look at the portrait of Jesus that we find in the book of Hebrews today. But before we begin, let me say how much I appreciate those of you, many more than I thought of, who have joined us in this study each week. When we finish this portrait of Hebrews, we will go to the last in the series, the portrait of Jesus that we find in the book of Revelation. I'm not sure that we can finish Hebrews today, but we'll get a start on it anyhow. Next Sunday, I want to remind you of our worship service that you can find on Facebook at Middle Fork Baptist Church, Blowing Rock. The sermon title is The Risk of Faith. I think you'll find it helpful. Now let's take a moment to be still before God before we begin our study. And maybe before our prayer, I should mention I've had a request from some of you about where do I find the prayers that I have been reading for you. And so I want to share just several. If you have a pencil and paper, you might want to jot down some of these titles. I want to share with you some of the books that have helped me in my spiritual pilgrimage through the decades. The prayer that a person asks about specifically, oddly enough, comes from the Book of Common Prayer from the Episcopal Church, which of course goes back to the Church of England, and of course on back then to the Catholic Church roots. Some of the most beautiful prayers in this book. I would urge you to, next time you're in a religious bookstore, purchase a copy of the Book of Common Prayer. Parts of it go back, of course, to Henry VIII's time when he broke apart from the Catholic Church. But I've found these prayers to be, many of them, to be like pebbles in a stream bed. They have been washed by the prayers and the tears and the hopes and the hearts of Christians through the centuries. And for us to think, and we pastors, sometimes we just get up to lead in public prayer without any preparation, without any thought. It's almost an insult to God. And I try to prepare myself for prayer before the time of prayer. I generally write out my prayer. And these are prayers that have expressed through the centuries what so many Christians feel. I recommend the Book of Common Prayer to you. I must hasten on here. John Wesley's prayer, when I hold these up, I'm not sure, I guess it'll be backwards when you see it, but at least you can see what the book looks like. John Wesley's Prayers. It was edited by Frederick Gill, Gill. All of these books, you'll have to go to a used bookstore. I doubt any of them are in print. It shows I've been around a long time, doesn't it? There is a little book that has been so helpful to me, A Diary of Private Prayer by a man named John Bailey. He spells it Baillie, Bailey. A Diary of Private Prayer. It's good for daily devotions. And here is a volume written by a man that some Christians think is a raving liberal. But I think if you read the book by Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, The Meaning of Prayer, you'll revise your opinion of this man who has been slandered by many through the years. Of course, he's been gone now for a long time. John D. Rockefeller, when Fosdick was a pastor of a Baptist church in New York, John D. Rockefeller said to him, Rockefeller was a member of his congregation, he said, you're packing the place out. Would you like a new sanctuary? And Fosdick, of course, says yes. And so that's how back in the Depression, I think something like $20 million were spent by Rockefeller to build a Riverside church for that congregation. You'll find that an extremely helpful book, The Meaning of Prayer by Harry Emerson Fosdick. And then this little book, and I have no idea where I picked it up, Your Prayers and Mine by Elizabeth Yates. Just a little short prayers like this, you see. And they are, again, like stones. Here on the page that I've turned to is a prayer by Loyola of Spain in the 16th century. Here's one, Charles Kingsley in England, 19th century. One by Sir Jacob Astley in England, 17th century. So these are well-washed stones that express what so many of us feel. Now, let's bow our heads as we pray together and listen to this prayer. Teach us, good Lord, to serve Thee as You deserve, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not to heed the wounds, to strive and not to seek for rest, to labor and not to ask for reward, except the knowledge that we do Your will. Beautiful prayer. Well, now let's turn our attention to this letter to the Hebrews. And I suppose as we look for the portrait of Christ that this writer has given us, that we need to clear out some underbrush first. Who wrote this letter to the Hebrews? Well, we don't know. It's been rather interesting for us to see who did the preaching and wrote the Gospels and so forth. But in this particular case, some people say, and I think in some of the King James editions of the Bible, it says that Paul wrote this book. Well, one thing we can say for sure, that Paul didn't write it. This language is totally different from Paul's use of Greek. This letter to the Hebrews is very polished Greek. Not like Paul, who often broke off in the middle of sentences and his emotions were really in his writing. This is a polished letter here. Some have said Stephen wrote it. Well, I suppose that's certainly possible. It seems most scholars think it was written while the temple was still in existence, or at least right around AD 70, whether the temple had just been destroyed or whether it was still standing. Some have said maybe Aquila and Priscilla. You remember them, the tent makers that Paul met on his journeys in several places. Some have said that Apollos, the silver-tongued preacher that Aquila and Priscilla met and tried to help him understand more clearly the Christian faith. Some have said that Barnabas may have been the author. We just really don't know. Obviously, whoever wrote it was steeped in the Old Testament and in the Jewish traditions. Perhaps the best we can say about it, and nor do we know to whom it was written exactly. There have been various suggestions written to the Christians in Jerusalem, written to the Christians who were scattered throughout the empire, written to the Christians in Antioch. We don't know. But what we can say about it is that the theme of this book is to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of the shadow of the high priesthood in the Old Testament. It is a contrast between the shadow and the reality. And so that's what we know about the beginning. So what's his portrait about Jesus? Well, first of all, he begins by ringing the changes on the eternal nature of Christ. If we just look at the beginning of the book, we will find several things. Just turn to the book of Hebrews here, and let's begin. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory, the reflection. He is the exact representation of his being. He is the stamped image of God, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. Now, he said a mouthful right there. First of all, he said when in his portrait, when you look at this picture of Jesus, he is the maker of the universe. Now, that's not particularly new to us. We've seen that, of course, in the writings of Paul and fourth gospel, this kind of thing. He also is emphasizing the unity of the Father and the Son. He speaks of the Son being the reflection of the Father's glory, the exact representation, like the image on a coin. He is the representation of the Father. And he is the maker of the universe. He's spoken to us in these last days by his Son, through whom he made the universe. Fascinating how he begins this. And then we find quickly an emphasis on the humanity of Jesus. Turn to chapter 4. There's some passages in chapters 4 and 5 that we'll look at for a moment here. The humanity of Christ. He says that Jesus was tempted just like we are, and yet without sin. Look at verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. I remember Jimmy Carter saying, yes, he had lusted after ladies. Jesus tempted in every way, just as we are, yet without sin. You know, they say you can't keep the birds from flying over your head, but you can keep them from building nests in your hair. I think this is worthy of contemplating. Look at verse 7 of chapter 5. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. There are those among my preacher friends who feel like Jesus knew everything from childhood on, that he knew everything. And yet that's not the picture that I find in the Gospels, nor is it the picture that we find here. We find here a growing awareness on the part of Jesus as to who he was. I think that's the picture we have in the Gospels. When is the end of time? Jesus said he didn't know. That is the Father's business. We speak of Jesus as being divine and human, and I believe he is certainly both. But I believe that in his humanity, when he laid down his equality with God that Paul speaks of in Philippians chapter 2 in that great emptying passage, the kenosis passage, when he said he did not consider his equality with God something that he must cling to, I believe that part of what he emptied himself of was that divinity of knowing everything. And we find here that he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. Remember the Garden of Gethsemane and the prayers there. He was heard because of his reverent submission. One like as we are, and yet without sin. I like to hang on to that because so often we're in circumstances where it gives us strength to know that Christ has been here. He understands what we're going through. He speaks, when he talks about the humanity of Christ, not just the tempted as we are and yet without sin, but he speaks of trust and sympathy with us, the dependence upon God that Jesus had and that we must have. Look at chapter 4, verse 15 again. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, for we have one who's been tempted in every way like as we are. He is able to sympathize with us. And you see there also that emphasis on the suffering of Jesus. In chapter 2, verse 9, and in verse 18 of the same chapter. Listen, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. In bringing many sons, we'll overlook this first century concept of patriarchism, in bringing many sons and daughters to glory. It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation from perfect through suffering, because he himself suffered when he was tempted. He is able to help those who are being tempted. An emphasis on the suffering of Jesus, this writer gives us. Strange when he is comparing now. Remember, the whole overarching thrust of this writing is to compare the shadow of the Old Testament priesthood with the reality of the eternal priesthood of Christ. But he begins by giving us, here in these early chapters, how Jesus understands us, sympathizes with us, has been where we are, and yet without sins. Then he comes to Jesus' work as being appointed the high priest. Look at chapter 3, verse 1. Therefore, holy brothers, who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, the apostle and high priest, whom we confess. Maybe we ought to talk a little bit about the high priest in the Old Testament and the background for what this writer is saying here. He is saying that we have a sympathetic high priest here. A high priest, look at chapter 4, verses 14 and following. He says that this high priest that we have, sympathetic to us, one who has been where we are, keep that in mind, and says that he is after the order of Melchizedek. Now, if you look at Genesis chapter 14, you will find that Lot, who had taken the choice land in the promised land when Abram came over from the Fertile Crescent area, and now Lot has been attacked by several kings in his area and has been taken hostage. And Abram gathers up his army and goes and defeats these kings and rescues Lot. It is on his way back that he meets a king named Melchizedek. If you look in Genesis 14, or maybe you should just let me read it for you, Abraham has already defeated these other kings. He's on his way back, and we find that Melchizedek, this is in chapter 14, verse 18 of Genesis. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, that's the older village which was later called Jerusalem. He brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And then Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And so what we find here, the bread and the wine presaging the Holy Communion, but we find that here is Melchizedek, who sort of appears out of nowhere, and he is the kind of king that or high priest that Jesus is. And if you look at that, the writer here, after he says Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, listen to this, chapter 5, verse 1. Every high priest is selected from among men and appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is subject to weaknesses. He's talking about the Old Testament priests. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sin, as well as the sins of the people. No one takes this honor upon himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was. So Christ also did not take upon himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." Notice also what the writer says in this 5th chapter in verses 10 and 11. Speaking of Jesus, he was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. We have much to say about this, but it is hard to explain because you're slow to learn. Okay, I think he really hit us right there, didn't he? Verse 19 of this 5th chapter. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary because behind the curtain where Jesus, who went before us, has entered on our behalf. He has become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Now, you might want to look at Psalm 110. Let me read a portion for you where we find a prophecy about Christ. And Simon Peter, in his preaching on the day of Pentecost, quotes this concerning Jesus. "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." And then later in that same psalm, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." So, pretty obvious there's a prophecy of Jesus as a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now, let's explain that. Look at chapter 7 now, some things in this 7th chapter of Hebrews. I won't read the whole thing, but let me just point out, Melchizedek, says the writer, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Don't know anything about Melchizedek's background. Scripture just says he turns up bread and wine and offers this to Abram, and Abram gives him 1/10 of all his possessions. He is a priest without any lineage. He is a priest appointed by God. Look at verse 4 and following of this 7th chapter. Just think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him 1/10 of the plunder. Now the law requires the descendants of Levi who become priests to collect 1/10 from the people, that is, their brothers, even though their brothers are descended from Abraham. This man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected 1/10 from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. And then we read further, if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, why was there still need for another priest to come? One in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron. Why was there a need, he says? If we had all this line of priests from Levi, why do we need another priest like Melchizedek without a lineage, without any genealogy, one who simply appears and is designated as a high priest forever? Look at verses 15 and 16. And what we have said is even more clear. If another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who has become a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life, But he became a priest with an oath when God said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." I think our time's about gone. I'm going to have to stop there. He is contrasting then the Old Testament priesthood with Melchizedek, who didn't come from any long lineage, but simply did what the high priest did when he met Abraham. And so he is saying Jesus comes to us like Melchizedek, speaking as one without authority, but who has the authority of the Father. I hope you'll join us. We'll wrap this up next time, but you may want to read the book of Hebrews between now and our next time we gather on Wednesday. Again, thank you for being with us. May the Lord keep you safe. It is our prayer.